Hey audio geeks, welcome back to the channel and thanks for subscribing and getting us over the line to 5,000 subscribers. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do just hit that button down below, only takes a second. Oh, and look out for the behind the scenes and FAQ video to celebrate 5,000 subs coming up on the channel soon. But today we've got a veritable 2 for the price of 1, as I've been kindly sent 2 new Chi-Fi IEMs. Shout out to Ivan from KeepHiFi. As usual, these have been sent to me free of charge for evaluation, and no money has changed hands for this review, so you can be sure that these thoughts are mine and mine alone. Okay, so here we have the CCZ Melody, which is the cheaper of the 2 sets, retailing at around $25, which pitches it firmly against the likes of KZ ZSN Pro X's, which I've reviewed before. For roughly double that, we have the me.Here, K-Bear, I think it's KeepHiFi actually, the me.Here Robins, and these are still very reasonably priced at around $50. But we all know that these price points are absolutely flooded with many IEMs from so many Chi-Fi manufacturers. So have these two got the qualities it takes to make them stand out from the crowd? Let's take a look. So I'm going to be looking at the me.Here Robins first. me.Here are another one of these companies that makes a huge range of IEMs to fit all budgets, and these are definitely in the budget sector, sitting somewhere between the Blonde BL03 and the Moondrop Arias, which are my top 2 picks for £35 and £70 respectively. That's what, $50 to $90, something like that. So first things first, and these come in an understated blue box. It's not too massive, which makes a nice change. And inside you get all the usual array of IEMs themselves, which we'll look at in a minute, the cable, and a reasonable silicon ear tip selection. You can see we've got black and white ones. We don't get foamies, unfortunately. You know I'm a huge fan of foamies. But also, what's nice for this price is that you get this tough and pretty unfussy case, really. It's roomy enough for the IEMs themselves, as well as a couple of dongles if you need them. It's much nicer, for example, than the one that comes with the Moondrop Starfields and the Arias. That's much smaller. The IEMs themselves look somewhat generic, but are nicely built with an aluminium faceplate and a plastic housing for the drivers. The faceplate features this nice dimpled texture, as you can see. I quite like the way they look. They come in this textured grey colour, or you can get them in blue as well. Now the cable is a standard 2-pin connector. The quality of the cable itself isn't the best. It does tend to tangle up a bit, although there are no real microphonics. I much prefer, for example, the cable that came with the OH1S from ICO that I reviewed recently. In fact, that's probably the only thing I liked about those. In terms of the mechanics of the IEM themselves, me.Here have crammed a total of 5 drivers in here. So we've got 1 dynamic driver, presumably to give it some bass and low mid slam, and then we've got 4 balanced armature drivers, and I believe there's a 4-way crossover to make sure the frequencies get distributed specifically. That's an awful lot to pack into such a compact chassis, isn't it? So how does it compete with the likes of the Moondrops, which, remember, just have 1 dynamic driver? The first thing to say is that the overall impressions are of a very lively pair of IEMs with plenty of forward bass and clear and present upper, mid and treble. This is definitely not a laid-back sounding listen like the Moondrop Starfields, for example, or the similarly priced TRN TA1s, which I described as being coated in honey. Now there is a frequency response graph, as you can see on the back of the box. I couldn't find a nice one online, and unfortunately it doesn't have the axes labelled clearly, as you can see. My physics teacher, Mr. Milsom, would have been quite cross about that. me.Here, 0 marks for you. However, you can see that what you get is a gently V-shaped tonality, maybe best described as a shallow V, with plenty of mid-bass emphasis and some treble extension. But how do they sound with actual music? I've been firing some of my favourite music at them. Lorde, as you know, released a new album last week, Solar Power, which, apart from the, how should we say, it's somewhat eye-catching cover, is far less interesting than her previous albums. And in fact, her previous album, Melodrama, is one of my favourites. I've been listening to that pretty heavily. There's also been plenty of Niels Fram as usual, particularly his last album, All Melody. I've also been listening to a lot of music from 1992. So I've had, for example, REM's Automatic for the People, Nirvana's Incesticide, a bit of Stone Temple Pilots, to name but a few. So the first thing to say is that certainly the bass on the Robins is rich and full-bodied, particularly the mid-bass, which really stands out. There is sub-bass extension, but it's more subtle. The timing is pretty good though, and acoustic bass instruments have a nice rich texture. If you enjoy bass-heavy EDM tracks, I think you'll like the Robins a lot, as there's a lot of physicality from the dynamic driver, and it means that the bass slams hard, much harder than in most IEMs, and it adds real dynamism and excitement in a very well-controlled manner. Now, if you are bass phobic, you might be a bit overwhelmed, and the downside is that there is definitely some appreciable bass bleed into the lower mid frequencies, but honestly, it's not terrible. Unlike many V-profiled IEMs, the mids are actually not particularly recessed here, and there's really good clarity and detail, for example the guitars on the Stone Temple Pilots album, or the fabulous pyrotechnics on Aneurysm by Nirvana on Incesticide. Vocals, particularly female vocals, come across really well, so Lord's extraordinary vocals on Melodrama, for example, really stand out, particularly on the first track, Green Light. Another good example is Sear's acrobatic vocal line on David Guetta's Flames. Despite the background thump of the bass on this track, you can really pick Sear's vocals up very nicely. Overall though, the treble is definitely not sibilant and it's definitely not fatiguing, and I would say this is one of the best shallow V tuned IEMs for the price. The soundstage is actually pretty decent, not amazing, I mean not anything to write home about, but really not too bad, and the imaging is also above average. Timbre is decent. I can still detect the slightly metallic BA type sound to the upper mids, and it definitely doesn't sound as natural as a Starfield's, but for £40, remember £40, I'm really happy. Overall, believe it or not, I am pleased to give these the KeepHiFi Robins the official seal of approval by awarding them the Audio Fixation Bronze Award, and remember that's a high accolade, particularly for a budget set of IEMs. Okay, so now we come to the second set, the even cheaper CCZ Melody IEMs. Now these truly are a proper budget pair of IEMs for £20, around $25 or so. They are very reminiscent of the KZ ZSN Pro X in their packaging. And obviously you only get some basic accessories, so the IEMs themselves, the cable, and a few spare ear tips, but you don't get a case or anything like that. I've got the Stealth Black model as you can see here, and again it feels pretty solid for £20. I think it's a plastic housing all round, but there is a nice little design touch, so if you just look at the bit of the IEM that sits in your ear, it's got this slightly rubberized texture, which means it stays in your lug hull pretty securely. The cable is actually very similar to the one on the KeepHiFi Robin, and in fact the two are interchangeable, and the main body of the cable is slightly thin and cheap feeling. It's nothing to write home about, and again it's really prone to tangling up. Now I don't have, unfortunately, a frequency response graph for these. I couldn't find one online, so you'll just have to trust my sonic impressions of them. On the surface, they have some similarities to the KeepHiFi set, in that once again we have a V-shaped tuning with a similarly pronounced bass and a slightly forward upper, mid and treble. The mid bass, I would say, is slightly less elevated than on the Robin, but it's certainly not as nicely textured. It's still okay though, and does bleed slightly less into the lower mids. Certainly you don't get that same bass slam, and the timing isn't quite as acute as it is with the KeepHiFi set. The mids are okay. They definitely aren't as detailed as the Robins, but they're still present, making something more acoustic sound nice. Lack of detail will certainly bother some people more than others, and come on, you can't expect that much detail from 20 quid IEMs. The upper mids, however, and the treble is where you'll really notice the difference between these and the Robins. There is no shoutiness, but there's definitely quite a lot of sibilance, and a lot of detail smearing in particularly cymbals, for example. The cymbals sound a bit splashy, a bit smeared, just, yeah, not nice. Instrument separation is okay, but the sound stage is definitely very narrow and enclosed in your head, as you'd expect from an IEM at this price range, and given the technology inside, which incidentally is one dynamic driver and one balanced armature. You really do get that unpleasant, bright, metallic glare in the vocals and guitar that characterizes cheaper balanced armature IEMs. Now it sounds like I really hate these, doesn't it? And I really don't. Honestly, I think they're okay for £20, and I would even go as far as to say that they compete rather favourably with, for example, the KZ ZSN Pro X. Man, I'm never going to get used to saying that. Now those are perhaps a little bit more detailed, but also for me the KZs are much more shouty and fatiguing, and given the choice between these or the ZSN Pro X's for £20, particularly if you're talking about prolonged listening, I would probably choose these. So no award for these, I'm afraid. They are okay for £20, but if you're going to spend 20, I would recommend you spend 30 and get the blonde BL03s instead, which are far, far superior. If it's a choice between the blonde or the Robins, I don't know, that's much tougher. I still really love the blonde. I think they sound overall just that little bit smoother and more natural, but I really like the bass and the airy treble on the KeepHiFi. I think it is better than on the blonde. So I think these are a very strong recommendation, and it's certainly better than the TRN TA1s. So those are my thoughts, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video as always. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Look out for that 5,000 sub special coming up. Take care, and I'll see you next time.